got away. Other people spoke of seeing troops opening fire on a young prisoner, and as he was being led back to the jail, he turned to astonished bystanders and said, "It was worth a try, wasn't it?"
Sunday, September the 25th, 1983. The darkest hour in British penal history. 38 Republican terrorists did what was until then regarded as impossible. They broke out of Northern Ireland's top security prison, the Maze, near Lisburn. The IRA had scored a morale-boosting victory for Republicans. For Margaret Thatcher's government, it was a propaganda disaster.
It is a very grave incident indeed, the most serious in our prison history. The Secretary of State, Jim Pryor, has set up an inquiry immediately.
The escape was planned and executed by men prepared to kill to make it succeed. Prison officer James Ferris died as he tried to raise the alarm. He'd been stabbed 3 times. 2 other prison officers were shot and wounded. 4 others were stabbed, and 13 were kicked and beaten.
I think I would refer to the Maze prison at the time as being rather like what I, not having been there at the time, but the Colditz during the war was an impregnable fortress in which we kept a lot of prisoners. And the Maze, when one first went there, looked rather like that. And for these prisoners to have got control of their block, the H7 block from which the 38 escaped, in a matter of, I think it was 20 minutes, was absolutely staggering. And so I think anybody to have achieved that must regard it as a matter of congratulation.
I know the IRA talked about Colditz and all this sort of thing. The people who were in Colditz were soldiers who were fighting for their country in uniform, under arms, who'd been put into Colditz. These were terrorists who'd ruthlessly behaved outside prison, killing and involved in all sorts of other terrorist activity, trying to bomb the people of Northern Ireland into a political solution that they didn't want, or, on the other side, taking activities to frustrate that aim by Republicans. And they were in prison, having been tried by the court system, and they were a lot of rotten apples all together in the same place, and I have no admiration or time for them whatsoever.
The Maze has been a thorn in the authorities' side since it was first established as Long Kesh internment camp in 1971. Until 1976, convicted terrorists were given what amounted to prisoner of war status. They were not asked to wear prison clothing or do prison work. But the withdrawal of that special category status sparked a sustained campaign of protest against what was viewed as the government's criminalisation policy. IRA prisoners refused prison clothing and wore only blankets. They extended the campaign later by smearing their cells with their own excrement. Outside, there were street protests, and the IRA murdered 13 prison officers in as many months, beginning with the death of Maze Deputy Governor Albert Miles on November the 26th, 1978. One of the Maze escapees, Kevin Barryart, was serving life for his murder. The protests culminated with the hunger strike of 1981, when 10 prisoners starved themselves to death. According to the prisoners who've written their own account of the escape for an anniversary issue of a Republican magazine, by the spring of 1982, those responsible for planning the breakout decided to join the prison system. Their real intention was to lull warders into a false sense of security. History shows the prisoners succeeded in duping staff. 38 broke out of H Block 7. Half were recaptured almost immediately. But today, the Northern Ireland office say 12 are still on their missing list. IRA leader Larry Marley headed the group which planned the escape. He himself didn't go out and was later shot dead by loyalists. But Marley's co-conspirators in the planning of the escape did make the break. The plan was simple. Armed prisoners were to take over the block, hijack a food lorry and drive out the front gate. Few inside H Block 7 knew of the escape plan, and as key figures began a process of conditioning prison staff into lowering their guard, eyebrows were raised at the sight of hardliners apparently going soft. Many were surprised to see convicted killer Brendan McFarlane cleaning floors as an orderly and drinking tea with prison staff.
Yes, I mean, I'd helped crews with the crossword puzzles or talk to them and ask them about football, etc., etc. Some people had it, you know, maybe were a wee bit taken aback that, you know, so soon, you know, we're moving into this new regime and this new era, and a wee bit too palsy-walsy, but obviously you can't go and tell people, look, the only reason I'm being palsy-walsy is, you know, there's equipment coming in here, and what we need is a bit of peace and quiet. We don't want these guys going mad, or there's an escape coming off. You can't tell people that.
The prisoners set out to take over the control area of H Block 7 at gunpoint. The 6 men carrying pistols were under no illusions about their role.
No Republican prisoner would have been issued with a firearm unless that Republican prisoner was clear about his total commitment to the success of the operation.
Even if it meant killing someone?
Whatever that entailed. Whatever that entailed.
And they would have been prepared to do that?
They would have been prepared to do anything that would have made the operation a success.
After Sunday lunch, 7 orderlies, 6 armed with pistols, moved into the circle. Other prisoners took up positions close to staff guarding the wings, or stood next to alarm buttons to prevent their use. The signal to overcome the guards was a shout from McFarlane for a bumper, prison slang for a floor polisher. They'd rehearsed their moves the 2 previous Sundays. The control room was protected only by a locked grill door. The security door opened against regulations for ventilation purposes. Jerry Kelly pointed a gun through the grill at the officer inside. When Kelly's attention was distracted, the officer moved to close the door. There was a struggle to prevent him. 2 shots were fired, and the officer was wounded in the head. But by then, the remaining 23 officers had been overpowered. As the wounded officer got treatment, the captors had become the captive. The taking of H Block 7 lasted just 20 minutes. Once the prisoners had taken over H7, they waited for the food lorry which they planned to use as transport to the front gate. The officer driving was tied to the seat and told a hand grenade was attached underneath. An armed prisoner covered him from the floor of the cab.
When the lorry arrived, our man on the gate let the lorry into the block. When the lorry stopped, we arrested the driver and we told him that we were using his lorry to effect the escape of Republican prisoners, and he was driving it. We put him through a fairly intense psychological couple of moments to assure that he was likely to carry out all of our demands. As it turned out, he did. When the lorry arrived, and the lorry driver was properly briefed, and we then loaded the prisoners on to the back of the lorry. The last prisoners to go onto the lorry were those who were dressed as screws, because they would be forced out to effect the next phase of the operation.
The lorry, packed with prisoners, was waved through 2 internal security gates without searches before it reached the prison's main entrance. This was where the IRA's plan started to go wrong. They'd intended taking over the tally lodge in order to have control of the main gate. But a delay in the arrival of the lorry meant they drove right into a staff shift change. For a time, more than 20 prison officers were held by armed terrorists at the tally lodge, but as more staff arrived, the plot was uncovered and the alarm raised. Prisoners still in the lorry made a run for the gate.
Well, the lorry was stopped between, I guess it was between 2 gates, which is a toll area or something to that effect. As far as we were told, well, the vehicle was going to be leaving the prison grounds. It didn't, obviously something had went wrong. It was pretty much pandemonium. Everybody just piled out of the back of the truck, and it was every man for himself. People were taking cars, people were running. There was a lot of confusion because there was guards coming on. There was actually prisoners dressed as guards.
It was during those clashes at the gate that prison officer James Ferris was killed. He was stabbed with a screwdriver, but a post-mortem established that he died of a heart attack. Officer Ferris was already wounded when he ran to the front gate to warn colleagues an escape was underway.
So he tore off out of the gate lodge, shouting to the prison officer manning the pedestrian gate, lock it, shut it. I don't know what he shouted, but something to that effect, because prisoners are escaping. And it was while he was running away that another prisoner came up after him, and I think when he got pretty near the gate, stabbed him again, and he died. And the prisoner went on to stab the officer at the manning the gate, and indeed I think a third officer who was just coming in the gate, he stabbed him. So Ferris's actions with his wounds and everything else were extremely courageous. And I must say that the officers at the Gate Lodge were, we reckoned, behaved extremely well.
16 prisoners were later cleared of murdering prison officer Ferris.
Well, our view was simply that the law of the land is the law of the land, and judges will decide what is right in law. Prison officers never do anything else but accept the law of judgment as it is. We were aware that Mr. Ferris had a heart condition. We were fully aware of that. He was medically examined not long before that and cleared for his work. So at that particular time it was causing no difficulty with his employment. What brought about the difficulty was in the Tally Lodge when he was trying to make the move to get assistance. He was jumped upon and he was stabbed. It was the shock of that stabbing that exacerbated the heart problem and caused his death. So in reality, the judge, as the judge ruled at the trial, saw the charge of murder inadmissible. But one always has that thought in the back of your mind that had Mr. Ferris not been stabbed, Mr. Ferris today would have been alive and with his family.
In Northern Ireland, as a major search operation got underway for the escaped prisoners, the prison's minister, Nicholas Scott, was off duty, relaxing with his family at his London home.
I remember I was watching David Fearty, who was on the charge and in danger of winning a major championship, I may say at the time. And my stepson came charging downstairs and saying, "Nick, Nick, half a dozen fellas have got out of the Maze prison." So I immediately got on the phone to Stormont to find out what was going on and lost track entirely of David's performance, but I think for both of it was downhill from there on.
As Nicholas Scott was packing his bags for Belfast, 15 of the escapees were quickly recaptured in the vicinity of the jail.
A lot of lads made it sort of that way and the other way, but 4 of us came across here. I climbed this gate and went down the road there. So there was myself, there was Joe Simpson, Peter Hamilton, Sean McClinchy. The 4 of us were moving here. We had to be cautious. We heard the alarms, we heard the shooting, we were very excited. We knew what we had just achieved, but we knew there was also a lot in front of us. When we got to this point, we spotted the bridge. We seen the RUC in the bridge, and we went down, the 4 of us. There was screws in the bridge, there was RUC in the bridge, and the British Army were there. We had to move across the field to get to the lagoon. That's actually quite deceiving. It's very deep, so we were able to go into the reeds there and head in onto them because the helicopter was up, the RUC were in the bridge, the screws were behind us, and we had actually nowhere to go. And what we hoped to do then was wait there the darkness and possibly move along the side of the lagoon. Within a short period, an RUC man spotted a movement there. He alerted the rest of them. They all aimed their guns in our direction and called on us to come out. We came out, we put our hands up. Right? One of the lads actually said, one of us shouted, "Don't be shooting, we're unarmed."
Within days, 4 others were recaptured in the Castlewellan area. Paul Anthony Kane and Brendan Mead were arrested on a deserted country road. The police filmed Hugh Corey and Patrick McIntyre surrendering after a siege at a house in the Mournes. 19 other prisoners, many dressed as prison officers, did get away. 4 of the escapees used a prison officer's car to ram the prison's external gate.
2 other prisoners ran away the opposite direction, of course, and I followed them. I couldn't catch them. I thought one of them was a prison guard. I wasn't sure. I mean, it looked like a prison guard was running after a prisoner. That was my first impression, but when he turned around, his hat blew off and I could see it was just another prisoner, but I couldn't even catch them up. They got too much of a head start, so I cut through some houses that were just right beside the gate, and I hid in some shrubbery.
I made my way up along with about 5 or 6 others up this laneway. There was a small farm up there. And when I got up into the farmyard, there was a Mercedes sitting there and a Volkswagen van. So 8 of us took the Mercedes and drove off. come down the lane, turned up a small road, and then we moved out onto a dual carriageway, searching for them all around a bit.
And my memory at this point, I always remember was in my head, I didn't really understand why the Brit was not shooting. And it was only later on I actually sussed it out. Obviously what he was looking at was as far as he was concerned, screws fighting screws. I knew that the M1 was to my right. It was too far away. I thought the M1 would be blocked off. I knew that to the left, there was roughly about a half a mile up through the Brit camp. I expected that they would now know that the balloon was up, that they would be on guard. And what was behind me really was freedom. I was outside the perimeter wall, all that was between ourselves and open countryside. At that stage, about past, I think it was the governor's car park behind us, was about 30 yards, and then 9 feet of barbed wire entanglements.
Meanwhile, McFarlane, with another group of escapees, had taken over a house near Dromore and held a couple and their 3 children hostage. They concealed their hijacked Mercedes in the family's garage.
I do realise that it is a traumatic experience when people come into your house. What we had to do was to try and reassure the people that we didn't intend them any harm. We actually told them who we were. Now, they were very, very upset, and they were very tense. They were very, very nervous, which is understandable. So we spent a bit of time trying to reassure them, calming them down. I got one of the lads to make tea and a couple of sandwiches and that, and we just sat and we explained that we only wanted to be there for a couple of hours, and we wanted to be totally and utterly out of their lives as quickly as possible. And slowly but surely they began to come around a wee bit and settle down.
There was a Jeep shortly thereafter had parked practically on top of me, so I just laid low. I could actually listen to their conversation, and I was afraid to breathe even, for fear that I would draw attention to myself. And after they left, and after people had come off the streets and went into their homes, then I went looking for some clothing to put on because I was starting to get cold.
So where did you find the clothing?
Well, I tried neighborhood cars in the neighborhood, and everybody, of course, security conscious, had locked their cars, so nothing was open. But I found a shed that the lock wasn't completely closed on, like a tool shed. And when I went in there, I found a woman's cardigan, and I found a number of bikes that were in there. And I took one of the bikes out of the shed, and then I decided, what the hell? I just got on the bike and rode the bike past the gate. I came out, and the only way I know back to Belfast.
You actually drove past the gate that you'd run through earlier?
Yeah, they were actually still working on it. They were still reconstructing it, I guess. The car was gone, but they were fixing the gate. I mean, it was closed over, but I could hear them working on it.
And no one gave you a second glance?
No, not at all. There was actually a couple of kids sitting in the neighborhood that I said hi to as I rode past them on the bike, so there was no...
So where did you go on the bike then?
Well, I got arrested at the bottom of that road. I'm not too sure what the road's called, but it's the one that leads up to the Longcash prison. And I was asked for identification, which I didn't have, of course, and I made up a name and told them I was from the university area, around Botanic Gardens, and they took me in, but they wouldn't let me bring the bike with me, because I said it would save me some of my trip. And the police officer insisted that the bike would stay at the roadblock, so they brought me into Lisburn Police Barracks.
I had my own clothes in under the prison uniform, or the screws uniform, which become very heavy, and I zigzagged up the hill thinking I was on my own, and sort of halfway up the hill, and you're running up thinking you're going to dodge this and that, you look around to see what's coming behind you, and when I looked around, it was like 40 following me. He must have thought I knew what I was doing, but I mean, I didn't know what I was doing any more than anybody else.
Kelly's group eventually made it to the home of a former Republican inmate.
We made contact with a prisoner fairly dramatically, actually. He was watching Match of the Day when we landed in, and was shouting his name in the middle of the house. He lifted about 4 feet off the sofa. But he went away and got us put up in a house, and then went away to get some help, because what we expected was there'd be a lot of rain. We didn't come in sort of quietly. It was sort of, people would have noticed the uniforms. I mean, I was half dressed with just one shoe on, one shoe off and all that. So it was like a lifetime. But I suppose after about 20 minutes, somebody came along and said, well, have you got a car with you? I said, well, yeah, there's a car. And there was about, at this stage, it was 5 of us had been in the car, you see. And yeah, we'll have a car, where is it, And we had been going to throw the keys away, but we gave him the keys. And we only heard this later on. What happened is the guy went out, the guy drove the car down till right beside the border. It looked like we had crossed the border, and as far as people were concerned, and the authorities, we were across the border.
Well, we had established earlier on in the evening that they were a good Christian family that had been talking about their church hall and about prayer meetings, etc. So I felt that to avoid, if possible, any of the other options that we had put to them, that if we could get them to take their principles and put their principles in the lane and swear on their principles, that they wouldn't go to the police for 72 hours, that we would accept it. Now, I know it's a long shot, and a lot of people wouldn't go for it, but the dilemma was that, you know, I didn't want to leave anybody behind, I didn't want to take anybody from the house with me, and the other option was simply, I didn't want to tie them up, obviously, but if they were prepared to swear in the Bible, then I was prepared to accept that, and I gave her the guarantee that if they did that, that nobody would be harmed, or nobody would be taken from the house, nobody would be taken away.
So how did that come about? I mean, did they physically bring a Bible into the room?
Yes, they did okay. They had the family Bible, and they opened the Bible. And she talked with her husband, and she told the children what the situation was, and they all agreed. So they just swore on the Bible that they wouldn't go to the RUC for a period of 72 hours. And I said that I was very happy with that, and absolutely, there would be no problem. We would just leave the house quietly that evening.
The family, after consulting with their minister, kept their part of the bargain. Now, did you take anything from the family?
Yeah, we took a number of things. We took some food, not a lot. We took some food. We took 2 rucksacks, and we put some cheese and potato bread and soda bread. Took a couple of small knives, some biscuits, chocolates, some milk, orange juice, and a couple of bottles of water. We also took some heavy clothing, like sweaters, tracksuit bottoms, and I think, yeah, the 2 young lads had a scout map and a small compass. We took those as well, and a radio.
So you stole these actually from this family?
No, we didn't steal them at all. You know, the object of the exercise was simply that we needed this stuff to get out into the fields. We needed food, we needed that. So I wrote them a receipt for whatever they took. I took an inventory of everything that we took, and I signed it, and I gave it to the woman in the house, and I told her that in the event that she was prepared to go, she would obviously have to go to Belfast, that she was prepared to go and contact the Republican movement, that because of the signature and because of the list of stuff that was on it, that they would reimburse her to at least a relative value of what we had taken.
Not surprisingly, the inventory was never presented for payment. When you were inside Lisburn police station, then what was going on around you as you sat there?
There was a lot of activity. I was sitting in the waiting area, and there was the hatch which all the activity was taking place. There was a lot of officers running back and forth. I even think I seen one that I recognized from when I was taxi driving, you know, a regular RUC officer. I was pretty scared, but I thought I'd given up the ghost. I mean, I pretty much thought that I was just waiting to be taken into another room, or I thought I was waiting for detectives or something. I don't know what I was, you know, why I was left sitting there. When they came back and the 2 officers that brought me in came back and told me that they were taking me, it was time for me to go, and they were taking me back to the roadblock. I was really suspicious then. I mean, I didn't know what was going on. I thought there's a kink to this, you know. But
so what conversation did you have with those officers who had taken you into custody?
well, I asked them, you know, various questions to do with the escape. I mean, acting, you know, a curiosity seeker. I mean, have you caught anybody yet? And, you know, what's going on and who escaped and how many are there of them and, you know, that type of thing. I mean,
what were they able to tell you?
Nothing really. I mean, they pretty much didn't see any activity from what I could gather. I mean, I think they were the late shift that was coming on that were, you know, stuck at a roadblock, which was pretty boring and humdrum for them. So that's the impression I got. I mean, I could be wrong.
How can you carry that kind of thing off? I mean, you must be...
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I guess just nerves, adrenaline, I don't know. It's something. St. Jude, you know.
Art claims he cycled on to Belfast before going to America. An RUC spokesman said there was no evidence whatsoever to substantiate Art's story. Kelly and 7 others, meanwhile, took refuge under floorboards of what they considered a safe house.
The floorboards were very small, very low. I mean, the floors were very low. It was full of rubble and all that there. We got sleeping bags down. You couldn't shift. The height would have been sort of like the width of your shoulder. So that's as far up as you'd go. People were very good. They then got us down, because this was the same night of the escape, they got us down radios, were earpieces. They got us down the papers, so we were able to find out what was going on. And they sent us down a bucket, a sealed bucket, that we could urinate in or whatever. We would have went up to go to the toilet or have a shower for the first couple of days, but then again decided, took it upon ourselves to say, look, well, it's not a good idea, we'll just stay down. We didn't expect it to be 2 weeks, but it was actually 2 weeks that we were in this.
The first night, on the Sunday night, I would say that after about 2 hours walking or so, we had just got into the fields, and there were a couple of jeeps come past. We were just inside the field, a couple of jeeps come past, but they didn't stop. I don't even know if they were UDR or soldiers or police. That was the only thing on that night. There was absolutely nothing. We just got a free run the whole first night, right through to about 5 o'clock in the morning. It moved only at night because during the daytime, I mean, if people spot you, I always found it that, you know, McElwain told me that in times, or if people spot you, farmer will spot you 3 or 4 fields away. You know you're strangers, and you could pass on a remark to someone else. Oh, I've seen a couple of boys up there. So just moved at night so that nobody would see us at all, and stayed in during the day.
And did you walk to the border?
Yeah, the whole way.
People in the house cover your presence. I mean, because presumably they would have had visitors calling at their home.
Oh, that's right, and they did have visitors calling, and the way we covered it was, I mean, they would sort of knock on the floor, you know, if anybody was coming to the door, and then there would just be complete silence. I mean, that's the rule we had. You didn't talk. When we spoke anyway, throughout the whole 2 weeks, we spoke very quietly. I mean, that was a general rule. And the people went out and went about their business. Their nerves must have been totally wrecked, you know. After 2 weeks, contact was made, and it was decided after some conversation, that people would move out in twos, one night at a time. And that was put in motion to go across the border.
Security forces north and south mounted a massive search for the escapees. None were found. An inquiry was set up into what went wrong at the maze, to be headed by Sir James Hennessy. Nicholas Scott, who had been responsible for prisons for less than 4 months at the time, was under growing pressure to resign.
It was one of the more difficult times of my political career, as you can imagine. I took the view that if any decision I'd taken, or failure to take a decision, during that period, that was my responsibility, had contributed to this escape, then I would think I would certainly have felt it necessary to resign. And indeed, I offered to Jim Pryor to resign if necessary. He took the view that we were in it as Secretary of State and the Minister responsible together. We would wait for Sir James Hennessy's report. If any blame was put at our door, we'd have to reconsider our position. But until he had reported, there was no question of resignation. Indeed, that would in itself have further contributed to the self-satisfaction of the IRA.
Sir James, who began his investigation the day after the escape, was quick to identify lapses in security procedures.
Despite the 17-foot-high perimeter, 2,000 yards long, and an inner fence 16 foot high, and the prison divided into segments and blocks and gates and all the rest of it, despite all that, the key weakness was at the main gate out of the wall, where the people controlling the gate were in a rather flimsy wooden building to which anyone could have access from inside the prison. Now that's unheard of. You'd never see that in a prison in England. So that was a real weakness in the physical security. It was known to the authorities, and they were going to do something about it, but they hadn't got around to it. The second physical weakness was in what was called the circle within the H block itself, where the key man who controlled communications with the prison control room and the gate and all the rest of it was in what was supposed to be a completely secure area with bulletproof glass, a steel door and a steel grill. He was in there and should have been impregnable, not being able to have got at. But to communicate from his inner sanctum with the staff outside, which he had to do, it was necessary to open the door. And indeed, in order to live in that area for any length of time, he had to open the door, we were told, because there was no other way of getting air in. It wasn't air conditioned. So at the time of the escape, that inner door was open, and only the grill door was there. So it was possible for one of the prisoners who had a gun to point it through the grill and shoot him, which again, that was a key weakness. So there were those two key physical security weaknesses. In addition, there were all the normal security procedures which you would expect to have been followed and which were all laid down as being there for the staff to follow, many of which had not been properly followed.
Hennessy was shocked to find that IRA leaders in H7 had been appointed orderlies, giving them crucial access to the circle area.
And they managed to get at least 3 of their leaders, IRA leaders, believe it or not, appointed as trusted orderlies. I mean, it's absolutely incredible to an outsider who knows that an orderly ought to be a trustee, that you should have this sort of man appointed as an orderly. Shouldn't have been allowed.
And use of such people was totally against the NIO rules, which you're aware. Orderlies should be low-risk prisoners who are unlikely to escape or become violent.
Of the 19 men who got away, 3 are now dead. Seamus McIlwain, Patrick McKierney and Kieran Fleming were shot by security forces in 3 separate incidents while on what the IRA describes as active service. Gerard Kelly and Brendan McFarlane were arrested in Holland and extradited after a lengthy court battle.
Are you able to prove your innocence now, immediately?
No.
Kelly was returned by the Dutch only on the basis that he should not serve the remainder of his life sentence for bombing London in the early 70s. He was sentenced to 5 years for his part in the breakout, but served only 13 months after his period in Dutch custody was taken into account. He's now free. McFarlane has not yet been given a release date. Gerard MacDonald was arrested in Glasgow along with the IRA gang responsible for the Brighton bomb. He is currently in prison in England. For 3 of the Maze escapees, it was a case of escape to Alcatraz, the once notoriously tough prison island off the Californian coast at San Francisco. It's here that Jim Smith, Kevin Barry-Art and Paul Brennan built new lives for themselves since they arrived illegally 8 years ago. Today, however, all 3 are back behind bars in separate prisons, awaiting the outcome of extradition proceedings, but where the warmth of the sun is matched by the warmth of the welcome.
Political refugees have a right to remain in this country, and it's my firm belief that Jim Smith is a political refugee.
Jim Smith's public defence lawyer expressing a view widely held in Irish America, and in such circles, Smith enjoys a celebrity status. And thanks to bail on health grounds, he's even managed to attend meetings of supporters of the 3 escapees, known in San Francisco as the H Block 3 Committee.
On the 27th of September, when Jimmy's trial starts, we're going to have rebuttal witnesses to the British claim that there is no repression against Republicans or nationalists or ex-prisoners in Northern Ireland. And we'll probably have Father John McVeigh, Neil Blaney, Ken Livingston, and Bernard McAllister coming over.
We've got some really great people coming, and a lot of them would prefer not to stay in hotels. So if anyone's willing to have people like Bernadette or...
Bernadette.
Have you ever been to Northern Ireland?
I haven't been to Northern Ireland, no, but I have been to Ireland. But I have not been to the north. I plan to go to the north sometime this next summer and try to see for myself.
You're making judgments about Northern Ireland, but you haven't been there.
Yes, it is perhaps strange.
A condition of Jim Smith's bail is that he must wear an electronic bracelet which transmits a signal to the sheriff's office. It triggers an alarm each time he leaves his home. So his every movement has to be agreed in advance.
I'm going to work tomorrow, Michelle, at 7:30, 6:30. That's Friday, and also Saturday.
Once the sheriff's office knows his daily itinerary, Smith is free to resume his life, working as a painter and decorator.
If I go with outside like a 100 feet radius with the monitor's position now, there will be an alarm will go off, and that goes down the telephone line to the federal building, an alarm will go off down there. The people will check the books down there to see if I'm supposed to be away, and if I'm not, they'll call the house to check to see what's going on. If there's no answer at the house, they will inform the United States Marshals.
Would it have been easy for you to cut that bracelet off and get away again, run?
I could cut this bracelet off, leave it here now, and take a hike. What good is it going to do? I'm going to be on the run again. I'm going to go back to square one. I told the federal judge last year, my running days are over.
After arriving in America, Smith got married, got a new identification, and managed to obtain an American passport, which enabled him to make 3 trips back to Ireland. He was arrested by the FBI as he left for work on the 3rd of June last year, at exactly the same time, on exactly the same day, as Kevin Barry Art was taken into custody in San Diego. But precisely how Smith and Art's secret lives were uncovered isn't quite clear.
There was a so-called friend of mine from years ago come into the Los Angeles area. He's been trying to make contact with me through my brother and through other members of my family. He knew I was in America somewhere, but he wasn't sure where. And he was asking my brother Martin, where is he? You know, I'd like to go and meet him and have a drink with him. And all he said was, listen, I don't know where he is, and I'm sure if it did, I wouldn't tell you anyway. He was living in Los Angeles, and he came up here for a painting job. And I bumped into him in a bar, one of the local Irish bars. And it just went from there. He knew me from he was about 14 years old. He got on the telephone and started calling his people back home that he had met me, using my real name down the phone. To Belfast, everyone in Ardagh knew it. And it was through these phone calls back home, I say that the RUC, the British government, got onto me. They sent the fingerprints over to the FBI and informed them that one of the escapees is living in the San Francisco area.
They say they caught me, they found me because of fingerprints that were on file with DMV for an auto sales license. But I've since learned that that's not the reason how they came upon Smith and myself. Apparently, some female who was having an affair with an agent knew of Smith and mentioned Smith's name to the agent, and the agent, of course, started an investigation. And they got on to Smith first, and because of the tie between Smith, we had adopted the identity of dead twin brothers. They got to connect. They found me in San Diego. And so they watched us they watched Smith for something like 6 months and watched me for 3 to 4 months before they actually finally arrested us.
Whatever the truth, the FBI was reluctant to offer a clear insight into their timely detection.
There was a request from the British government. We initially made some effort to locate some of these fugitives by a fingerprint check, which was initially unsuccessful. However, we did a California state check, which was successful in identifying where Mr. Art was. And then we subsequently identified Mr. Smith through the same fingerprint check. They were both charged with passport violations in conjunction with that.
Now, they both escaped from the Maze prison 10 years ago, and were living here for some years. Certainly in one case, Jim Smith's case, for something like 8 years. So,
that's our understanding.
When was the request made for you to trace them?
I don't recall the exact date of the request. I know that we.
Was it 10 years ago?
I don't remember, but I know that we made an additional effort through the state fingerprint check. The initial check countrywide was not successful.
There's a great deal at stake in the Jim Smith extradition trial here in San Francisco. It's the first test of the new treaty between the two countries involving a fugitive from Northern Ireland. And so far, rather than simplifying and speeding up the procedure, it's giving the defence an opportunity to effectively place the British government on trial.
The 1986 supplementary treaty removed certain offenses from the category of what was called the political offense exception. Those offenses are murder and bombings and related offenses. In addition, it added a provision which permits a limited inquiry by the court where the fugitive is found.
The treaty provides that if the requested country, in this case the United States, feels that additional evidence is needed for the judge to be able to make a decision on extradition, the requesting party, in this case the UK, shall provide it. When I learned, based on my research in northeastern Ireland, of the Stalker Report and the Stevens Report and the Kincora affair and other incidents that had occurred there that had been studied by the British government, I realized that that information would be very helpful to our judge in deciding whether Jim would be prejudiced if sent back. So based on Stalker's book, Stevens' summary report, and other information from the press and from other sources, I was able to provide Judge Caulfield with enough information that she deemed for herself that this information would in fact be helpful to her in making a decision as to whether to grant extradition. She then ordered the British to produce it to her, not saying that she would give it to Jim or distribute it to the public, but simply she wanted to review it for herself to see if it would be helpful to making her decision, and they refused.
Britain's reluctance to place sensitive documents relating to matters of national security openly in a US court has already produced a setback. Judge Barbara Caulfield has ruled in Smith's favour.
Catholic Irish nationals accused or found guilty of offences against members of the security forces or prison officials are subjected systematically to retaliatory harm, physical intimidation, and death in Northern Ireland. Members of the security forces in Northern Ireland either participate directly or tacitly endorse these actions.
When Smith's case opens next Monday, the onus is very much on Britain to disprove these findings. Watching events closely from his prison cell is Kevin Barryart.
Were you in the IRA? Have you been a member of them?
No, I've never been involved in the IRA.
But what about the violence that the IRA uses to try and achieve that?
I can't condone violence because I'm not a violent person myself. It's not in my nature.
During our visit, Smith's bail was revoked. He drove to the Federal Court building to surrender. It was nearly tea time when he arrived. Inside, guards told him it was too late to process his papers. Could he come back in the morning?
CBS News Time, 8:13. Do you ever notice those people you see?
So after breakfast, Smith returned with his American wife Margaret by his side. And by this time, Smith's supporters had organised a news conference on the steps of the Federal Court building, where his fate will be decided at the opening of his extradition hearing next Monday. Dublin, the city where most of the legal battles to have May's fugitives returned to Northern Ireland have been fought. For the British government, however, the results have been less than satisfactory. Only one escapee, Robert Russell, has been brought back from the Republic in the past 10 years. There have been unsuccessful attempts to extradite James Pius Clark and Dermot Finucane.
Well, the extradition proceedings, you have to go through a series of court hearings. There's the District Court, the High Court, and the Supreme Court. And in the first two of those, my extradition was actually ordered. We went to the Supreme Court on appeal, and there was a re-examination of the evidence that we had produced in the High Court. The Supreme Court had found that the actions for which I was wanted, which is in relation to the conflict in the North, that it was actually political, and that the offences of escaping were also political. So they also then re-examined the evidence in relation to the shorter regime that the H-blocks was, and that it had been accepted by the judges that in the aftermath of the escape, that a large section of the prisoners had been systematically beaten.
Finucane's argument in this respect was supported by the fact that £171,000 has so far been paid out to inmates who were mistreated by staff following the breakout. Passing judgment in a case of ill treatment brought by a prisoner in the maze after the escape, the Lord Chief Justice, Sir Brian Hutton, said,
"There may be some who will ask, why should a prisoner who had been convicted of terrorist crimes be awarded substantial damages by a court because he was injured when prison officers gave vent to understandable anger after a successful mass escape by terrorists, in which one prison officer died, another was very seriously wounded, and others were injured and tied up? The plaintiff had been punished for his crimes by sentences of imprisonment, which he was serving, and like any other person, he is entitled to the remedies of the law against unlawful acts, whether he is in prison or out of prison.
It must have been quite galling for you to see a situation where people who were involved in an escape were getting money from the government.
It made me see red, I have to say, that the law is the law, and we operate under the law in Northern Ireland.
20 prisoners were convicted of offences relating to the escape and given sentences ranging from 5 to 8 years. Anthony Kelly and Seamus Clark were arrested in the Republic in separate incidents, and each was jailed for having a firearm. Both were freed earlier this year. However, Gardaí have made no attempt to rearrest them, and they are now living openly in the Republic. When Counterpoint asked why no extradition warrants had been issued, the Northern Ireland office said it didn't comment on individual cases, but a spokesman added, anyone who escaped from lawful custody in Northern Ireland is still likely to be subject to extradition proceedings. It's understood that following the Finucane judgment, the British government is anxious not to lose again in a Dublin court. A Northern Ireland office spokesman declined to confirm whether or not the British government was waiting for the new extradition legislation to be passed by the government in Dublin within the next few months. Of the 19 who got away, 5 have never been recaptured. Indeed, nothing has been heard of Anthony McAllister, Dermot McNally, Gerard Friars, Terence Kirby or Seamus Campbell since the day they escaped. Some of them are living in the Republic, and it was here in Dublin that Counterpoint spoke to one of those fugitives who's been on the run for almost a decade.
All the options were put to us by the Republican leadership in that area. The first option was given to us that we should leave the country, that they would set us up in other countries around the world with houses, jobs, basically just go to another country and disappear, have a trouble-free life.
And a new identity?
Of course, yeah.
And they said they could supply this?
Yeah, if you wanted it. They actually did do it. It's obvious from developments over the years that they have done it.
Today, 10 years after the breakout, the prison staff believe the danger of a repetition is just as great. Who runs the prisons?
The paramilitary run the maze.
Was that true in 1983?
That was true in 1983.
Is it true today?
It's true today.
So what's the likelihood that another escape could happen at the Maze prison?
If the circumstances feed themselves the same way, and if the people with the authority to work the regimes out don't change that system, there's every likelihood. Bear in mind, and I will concede, there have been a number of physical barriers put in the way within the Hennessy recommendations. Many have been completed, but the most important resource, which is staff, has been neglected. And it's been neglected since 1983, and it's still being neglected today.
So the Maze prison today, in your opinion, is as ripe for an escape as it was in 1983?
I would say so, yes.
Rejecting these claims, the Northern Ireland office said substantial security improvements had been implemented since the Hennessy report. Security was under constant review and had not been compromised since 1983. Meanwhile, the man in charge of prisons at the time of the escape says there's no place for the fugitives to hide. What point is there a cut-off where you say, well, let's forget about them if they're still out?
No, nobody's going to forget about them at all. They are terrorists. They were lawfully incarcerated, imprisoned, and they have escaped unlawfully, and it is the duty and responsibility of the government to ensure that wherever they are, we use our best endeavours to get them back, and we will continue to do that.
We had hoped to include Sir John Wheeler, the current Prisons Minister, in tonight's programme. Indeed, we consulted with the Northern Ireland office